I'm writing this to do an inquiry that was messaged to me on another piece of mine entitled Haunting in the Heartlands. In that story, I made reference to a phenomenon that a Native American chief told me and my uncle about. The inquirer was curious about the local folklore of the reservation, and seeing as how I didn't give much to any detail in my last writing, I'll correct that mistake now. One of the questions I was asked was, what tribe did you visit? And the answer is Nez Perce, part of my bloodline, along with Cherokee, Crow, Blackfoot, Sioux, and Apache. I believe my Native American blood is part of the reason I was allowed on the reservation to begin with. Second question was, where was this located? I don't want to give an exact location, but I will say that it was in Idaho, in a secluded spot away from the main reservation. And now, getting on with the story. The voices in the forest, as told by the chief, are the souls of the damned who had lost their lives in the woods. There had been many disappearances that were never solved. Since it was native land, the local police never investigated. He told me of a particularly brutal crime committed in the 1800s in which a group of travelers were caught off guard while they slept. A group of 9 travelers met a brutal end at the hand of an unknown assailant. If I recall correctly, it was 2 assailants armed with wood-splitting axes. They went from traveler to traveler, driving their axes into the skulls and abdomens of their victims. The chief said that the youngest victim was no more than 4, and was almost beheaded by the force of the downward blow coming into contact with his chin. Best guesses were that the assailants must have stood about 6 feet and weighed an approximate 200 pounds to deliver that kind of force. The souls of the victims have been seen in the woods time and time again. The most common apparition is that of the father, angry that he couldn't save his family. He's sometimes seen looking perfectly normal. Other times, he appears with half of his head hanging from a flap of skin on his neck. His abdomen is a little more than a black hole of gore and ichor. But on the anniversary of their deaths, you can see the brutal murders take place, if you have the stomach for it. The tribe has kept a pretty good record of the surrounding woods over the past, and have been adding to the details whenever they can. The year 1901, during a freak storm, a husband and wife took refuge with the camp, and sometime in the middle of the night, they were pulled from their tents and dragged into the woods by unseen hands. In the morning, the tribe attempted to find them, but couldn't locate hair nor hide of the missing couple. In the year 1933, a depressed man hung himself from a tree, despondent over the death of his beloved wife. His body was discovered several days later by a group of hunters. There were also several reports of cults over the years and a haunted creek. Now me being the dumb shit that I was, I attempted to find the creek. So me and my friend, Alaskolatat, which means animals running, by the way, set out one day and started through the woods. We walked for several miles over rough terrain, and right around the time of nightfall, we heard the trickling of water. After another few minutes, we finally came across the creek and were greeted by the sight of several orbs of light floating across the top of the water. We took a deep breath to calm ourselves and sat down on the banks, watching the orbs hover where they were, not flowing with the current, just kind of sitting there, floating. We didn't get a bad vibe from them, so we didn't feel any reason to be afraid. We must have watched them bounce and play for hours. We didn't talk, we just watched. It was peaceful, almost dreamy. The chief later told me of the gentle spirits that protected the creek. A man had once drowned, attempting to save his pet dogs from the current. Sadly, none of them survived. Bear in mind that this creek is probably 7 feet deep in some places. After a bad rain, the current is enough to keep you under. Now, one last story shared with me. The year was 1848. There was a family of 10 living in a small shack a short walk away from the aforementioned creek. The family consisted of a father, mother, her sister, the sister's 3 illegitimate children, and the couple's 4 young children, all crammed into a single-room lodging. The father would often spend days away from the shack, hunting for food and selling what he could to the locals. On one particular night, for reasons I have no interest in attempting to dig up, the father decided to stay home. He had apparently had a rather large score evidenced by the amount of meat found laid out to dry, but his actions had caught up with him. The locals had found out that his wares didn't come from local animals. Instead, they came from travelers. For several years, apparently, the man had sat by the side of the road robbing, killing, and finally cannibalizing his victims. The numbers weren't exact, but an estimated 200 travelers had met their dreary fate at the hands of the crazed butcher. The locals took justice into their own hands and followed the man back to his shack. This is a collection of a journal entry the chief let me read. The scene was far too gruesome to call a massacre. All that can reasonably be said is that we lost something that day, something sacred. We lost our greatest warrior. We lost our courage. The journal entry described a scene almost diabolic in nature. The man had been collecting the meat of the deceased for months, and much of it had gone untouched. The stench of rotting corpses hung acrid in the air like a poisonous cloud. The locals peeked in through the crazed man's window and found an even worse sight. The man was laying in bed making love to the bloated corpse of his wife as his family lay dead and rotting around them. The locals had seen enough. They kicked in the door and began beating the cannibal to death with whatever they could get their hands on. Another group began looking over the bodies. Many had died from a single deep slice to the neck. The wife, upon further investigation, had most likely been strangled to death. The locals dismembered the man and buried his body in 5 different holes, believing him to be a demon that would pull himself back together and revive if left to his own devices. The rest of the family were cleansed to appease their spirits and sat in the lodge. A chief and a shaman were brought to attempt to assuage the spirits before the lodge, and all inside were set to fire. One final attempt to cleanse the area of the foul demon-like presence that had inhabited it. To this day, should you stumble upon the piece of earth where the home stood, legend says that you could still smell the acrid stench of rotting corpses, and there are 5 small plots where the earth refuses to grow. All these aspects relate to the voices in the woods, because these woods are an area where the ground has absorbed human tragedy. Natives believe that the earth is sacred and can talk to us, so it makes sense that the woods had absorbed all the negative energy released by the tragedies, and disappearances would begin to warp from holy to a place of evil. The animals are quiet. The wind doesn't feel quite right. There is always the sense of someone just behind you, watching your every move. These are the woods that I roamed as a child. These are the woods where I had experiences I can't explain with logic and science. Believe me, I've tried. But none of that matters. What matters is what the chief told me so many years ago. If you hear the voices in the forest, don't look for them. Don't even acknowledge their existence.